Welcome to Networking RX, a podcast devoted to helping business professionals like you enhance your networking skills in order to become more proficient giving and receiving quality business referrals and improving the overall quality of your life and the lives of those around you. The Networking RX podcast is a production of AmSpirit Business Connections, an organization whose mission is to empower business success through networking.
Welcome to the Networking RX podcast. I'm your host, Frank Agan, founder and president of AmSpirit Business Connections. Today, we have another great guest. As our ongoing subscribers know, often on this podcast, I will be sharing ideas, insights, and best practices for building business relationships. Actually, often on this podcast, more often I have guests. These are people who are subject matter experts, authors, speakers, thought leaders, and social scientists, and they really help us unpack human relationships, how they work, why they work. Today on the program, I have Tony Chapman. Tony is a subject matter expert. He's a recognized thought leader in the area of workplace relationships. And he's devoted his adult life to understanding what makes people tick, how to bring out the best in people, including ourselves. We're all people, and how to pass this information on in simple and yet practical terms. He helps leaders, team members, and people from every background and diversity adopt empowering mindsets and strategies that allow them to adapt and reinvent and transform the results they produce, both personally and professionally. He's worked with hundreds of corporations, governmental agencies, including the Secret Service, Homeland Security, Chase Bank, Estee Lauder, which is not a governmental entity, by the way, but certainly an iconic name, NASA. But he's helped all these people reach new heights of effectiveness by understanding themselves and understanding others better. He's completed his first book called The Force Multiplier: How to Lead Teams Where Everyone Wins. And in 2018, he delivered his first TEDx talk, How to Stop Settling for Less. Tony, welcome to the program.
Hey, Frank, thanks for having me.
That's quite a background. You've touched it all: Homeland Security, Secret Service. It's pretty impressive.
Well, so my Secret Service story is I always go a day early, check out the area. I go, and they have this really nondescript building in Washington, D.C. And, I'm thinking, okay, there's nobody at the front. It didn't hit me that it was a federal holiday. It was like President's Day or Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday. And outside of D.C., you don't think of it as significantly as you do inside of it. So yeah. I'm like, okay, I don't know if this is the right building. So I go around the back to see if this is the right place. And all of a sudden, all these guys in suits and headsets start like rushing towards me because clearly now I'm in like the wrong area. And, I just started explaining who I was, and it was really cool. But I had this like microsecond of, this may be my last moment on earth. It was wild.
That's funny. That's a great story. So let's talk relationships and, understanding, mindset, strategies, things you work with your clients about. How do we build trust? How do we make these connections? And obviously you're talking to people and you and I, before we hit record, we kind of had this conversation about people are people. You're talking to people in corporations and governmental agencies. I mean, here you are, you're on the lawn of the Secret Service, and you're explaining yourself. And like you said, they just became cool with it. They read you somehow or another. Okay, this guy's for real,
Right.
And I think there is a degree that we read people on a very subconscious level. And I think that happens wherever we go, whether it's, a charity, a church, or the Secret Service.
Yeah, there's a lot of studies that say that, we build a first impression within roughly 7 seconds, right? And during that time, we decide whether we trust them, whether we think they're smart, whether we think they're educated, whether we think they're competent, whether we think they're attractive, all of these different dynamics happen. And so part of it for all of us is in these interactions, the more sincere you are, the more authentic you are, the more accepted you are. That's part of what people read, right? Just like what you said, the minute our actions and thoughts and micro expressions, they're non-congruent. The minute there's a conflict between them, we sense it. We don't know what it is. We're just like, something's just not right with this person. And it immediately shuts things down. So even in that first moment, just our honesty, our coming in with little agenda, except for really to treat people with dignity and respect, that means the world.
Yeah. Well, it's, one of the things that I noted from looking, kind of researching you, if you will, not in the manner that Secret Service might have, but, it's you do a lot with unconscious bias. And I think that's where those biases come in. And there's, when we think of bias, I think a lot of people go right to race, or they might go right to gender, generally race. But I think it's there. I know it's there. And the example I always use, Tony, I live in Columbus, Ohio, which is in the shadows of the Ohio State University. And their big rival is University of Michigan, and I'm a Michigan fan. I grew up in Michigan. And when I run into people who are wearing Michigan stuff, I know I got a friend, right?
Right.
I don't know anything about the person, but I just know, hey, okay, that we have something in common. They're part of my tribe. I'm using air quotes here.
Yep.
And I think we look for that. And I think that for me, that's the perfect example of, yeah, we have these unconscious biases, and there's really nothing we can do about them. Consciously, I've got a lot of friends who are Buckeye fans too. I think are great. My wife is a Buckeye fan. So I can certainly compartmentalize that there's this unconscious thing, and then there's also a conscious, more rational side to my brain that's saying, you know what? I don't like their fandom, but I love this person. And that's just, it's just part of who we are.
Well, so when you go into bias, I think, because you started to touch on it, we often think of prejudice and discrimination, right? We think of race, we think of misogyny, we think of homophobia. So I'd like to reframe this idea of what bias is. Bias is like an algorithm, right? It's how we make decisions. A simple example of an algorithm is a recipe. If you're going to make pound cake, you take a pound of butter, a pound of sugar, a pound of flour, and a pound of eggs, and you make pound cake, hence the name, right?
Yeah.
With people, it turns out that we have recipes as well. What does smart look like? What does safe look like? What does trustworthy look like? What does a threat look like? And we don't realize often that, unlike, seeing someone with a Michigan hat and, okay, you kind of consciously made a decision. That's one thing, but we don't often realize how quickly we start to respond based on these recipes. And that's what makes it unconscious. Like, for example, when I moved to New York State, what I did not expect were rattlesnakes, right? You don't think rattlesnakes in New York. So one day, because you hear about this all the time, one day I'm at the edge of my property and I'm kind of raking some leaves, and I hear my neighbor say something. I look up, and right as I look up, I feel something slither across my front foot, right? I look down, people can't see me, but it was about this thick around. I did not sit there and try to assess whether this snake was aggressive or assertive or a rattler. Before I knew what happened, I was 60 yards away going, what the? And you could imagine what came after what, right?
Right.
The key is, before I even processed something, I felt and responded. I think that's what we miss. And so now it's about race. Yeah, it is about it is about orientation. It is about all these other things, but it's also just as much about finding people who are, we're often charmed by people who are like us, right? You go to a job interview and you figure out, how do I connect with this person? And all of a sudden they like you and they hire you, and you're not even qualified because you figured out how to connect in these ways. That's often what we need to start thinking about when we think about unconscious bias, because it affects our ability to make objective decisions.
Yeah, I mean, as you talk about it, I think of the term heuristic processing, and that we have these shortcuts in our brain, and that's really what a bias is. And to a degree, it's kept us alive for eons, because there was a time on this planet where you didn't run into people from other tribes, if you will,
Right.
clans, or however you want to term it. And when you did, it generally wasn't a good encounter.
Right.
And we're in a different time, arguably a more civilized time. I mean, it's, I guess there's arguments against that as well, but I'm an optimist. I think that we're in a much better time. What we need to do is recognize that we have these biases, and there's these heuristics, these shortcuts going on, and they're important. Using the snake as an example, that might have been the best thing that you had done, is to run away.
Right.
So we don't want to do away with these things, but what we need to be able to do is, in a quieter moment, be able to rationalize away. Okay, you know what? It's just a big snake. It's not poisonous. It's a big snake. Or this person from another tribe, be it an Ohio State fan, a Michigan fan, a black man, a white man, whatever, a Hispanic. You know what? There's something in my mind, unconscious, happening, but rationally, you know what? Tony's Tony and Frank's Frank, and let's have a conversation.
Yeah, and that's a huge start to it. Honestly, it's the stopping and rationalizing, kind of breathing, getting some conscious thoughts in, and then even like you said earlier, the Ohio State, Michigan, fandom, but I'm married to someone who's an Ohio State fan. Also, the more we're exposed to people of these different categories, the more that starts to reprogram our biases, because we no longer look at them as a them. We start to look at them as an us. And so we start to have different responses to it. And, we could dig way deeper into this at some point, because this is a rabbit hole I love. What I mean?
Yeah.
But here's the thing. So now we take this, because the problem is these are very artificial categories, if you really think about them, right? When we start talking about race is an artificial construct that was created in the early 1600s. That was just to justify the transatlantic slave trade. We start thinking about things like political ideologies, which is like a huge thing right now, right? A lot of these, though, these are not these innate differentiators. So like before we got on the podcast, you and I were talking a little bit about generational diversity, right?
Yeah.
So quite often what starts to happen is we use ourselves as the benchmark, and then we look at others as others and thems and not part of the us, because we don't take the time to understand why they're the way they are, why they think the way they are, what experiences they've had. And the more we begin to do that, that's when empathy happens. And it's that empathy that helps us to overcome not only the biases, but to help us to really bridge the gap and create real connections.
Yeah, no, I mean, you're right. These are, I think the term used was social constructs. You say that, it's interesting. I was watching a program, and it wasn't too terribly long ago that we looked at immigrants from Ireland or Italy as being a different race. It's crazy.
Well, you think of the term, the police truck, the paddy wagon. That's a derogatory term that was used because the police were rounding up the paddies, the Irish, right?
Oh, okay. Didn't know that.
Yeah, it's that ethnicity part of it has the term ghetto. The term ghetto is a phrase to describe a Jewish neighborhood, because that's how Jews were. You look at even lynching. There was a large mass lynching in New Orleans, and the victims were Italian Americans, right? Coming over, taking our jobs, the whole narrative. Yeah. But so you've seen this thing change over time, which is also part of the explanation of this is why you can't say it's just all natural. Some of this is very much a construct. There's a researcher named David Eagleman. He's a neuroscientist, and I was listening to him on a podcast recently. He was explaining this experiment with functional MRIs where, the person sees someone get their hand stabbed with a needle, right? Mm-hmm. And immediately there's just this incredible amount of empathy, right? Sympathy, empathy, pain. But then they started taking the exact same hand and putting labels on it. political labels, religious labels. And you could see the amount of empathy changed based on the label of the hand. The natural, ouch, oh my gosh, that must have hurt response changed because they saw someone with a different political ideology than them, or a different religious ideology than them, or of a different race. And that also goes back to show how immediate this is, right? This isn't that they sat and thought about it, but just their natural response of viewing this person as going through a human experience changed. So when we start to understand, just like you used Irish as an example, how much is changed over the years, and looking at where we are right now and how much that's going to change over the years, we start to realize this whole thing becomes artificial. And the more we can understand that we're all people and all going through a human experience, the better we'll be.
Yeah, no, I think there's a podcast out there. The podcast it's called Hope Through History, but it's really based on the title is based on something that Winston Churchill said. He said, we can't predict the future, but we should be able to get hope from history. Is really what it was. And let's look at the past. And so we started having these conversations about relationships and race and other gender and all these sorts of these diversities, if you will. There was a time in this country where if you were from England, you were one of the first people here. You did not associate with those Germans. That was a different race, Yep. Now it's, then it was just like, okay, it's the Germans or maybe it was the Dutch, but then the Germans come along. It's like, no, the Germans are bad. Then it's just us, then it's the Italians and then it's the Irish. I have a lot of hope for what this country can do, what the United States can do. Canada, Mexico too. It's, the Americas, if you will. Because eventually we just assimilate with one another, and it's not necessarily, we just become one. We become tolerant, and I'll still be hated as a Michigan fan in Columbus, Ohio, on Saturdays. The rest of the week, I'm okay. And it's all in good fun. It's all in good fun. Let's shift gears here a little bit and talk about your work and how people can certainly help you. You got this book coming out. You've completed it. I assume it's out now.
Yeah, it's out. So,
Okay.
My work, what I do, normally organizations bring me in for one of a few reasons. A, has something to do with this idea of equity and inclusion and diversity. That's become a big thing over the last 2 years, but really for me, the last 4 to 5 years, I've been doing a lot of work in the bias area. And normally people don't call me because things are going great, right? Just like,
Sure.
We had a disaster, we need to pay money. Okay, gotcha. Or people want to really either change the culture of their organization to some extent, or really work with their leaders, because a lot of times what happens with leaders is they're brought in, they're really promoted because they were good contributors, but that didn't necessarily qualify them for leadership. And then often they're undertrained. And so my job is to come in and say, okay, you've got to stop looking at this job as just things, and you're working with people. And here's how people work. Here's how you lead them. Here's how you connect with them. Here's how you influence them. All of these things. Here's how you motivate them. And here's how you build trust with them so that they'll follow you in spite of the fact that you have authority and in spite of the fact that they're being paid for it. That's a lot of what I do. And it's what I'm passionate about. I think that the human experience is critical. So for me, that's what I focus a lot of my time and energy on. And as I continue, one of the things I was just sharing with someone last night, I'm adding back in something I used to do a lot of, and that's the personal part of it, the personal development, the individual responsibility, my realization is that better people make a better workplace and a better society. And the biggest issue that we're going through right now is that people are damaged. And so that damage, you see it manifest in how they treat other people. There's a researcher at Cornell, and he's the first person that I know of who is able to link how much a person believes in, understands, and lives out their kind of mission and vision in life, and to be able to quantify that to say the more they do that, the less likely they are to be discriminative. They're less likely they are to be racist, homophobic, misogynistic, all these other things. And to some extent that makes sense, right? But to actually see the science of it is incredible. And so, to me, part of that is the more we fix people, society fixes itself. And so I'm really also passionate about how do we become whole? How do we overcome our past? How do we just be our best person?
No, that's, I like that. Fix ourselves, fix society. Well, and as you're talking, I'm thinking there's probably a big demand for what you're doing, a growing demand for what you're doing, simply because of what technology has done. Certainly what the pandemic has helped us do is to realize that we can work. We don't have to go to work. I don't have to move. I can commute. So all of a sudden we're finding ourselves working with people literally all around the world, and realizing that, the young woman in India has the same damn problems with her kids that I have, right?
Yep. Right.
They might eat different foods and pray to different gods and things like that. But at the end of the day, her damn kids won't wear their boots either, or whatever it might be, play too many video games, whatever it is. And then you start to really kind of empathize. It's like, okay, there's really no difference here. They're not, we're all just trying to survive. We're all just trying to, have a happy life. And that's, I think, at the core of what you're doing, is just getting people to realize that that's where it's at.
Yeah. There's a book I read years ago called Values for a New Millennium. And the premise behind it was that there's two things we all share in common. We want to take care of ourselves, and we want to take care of the people that we love. We all share that. And a lot of times we misinterpret what people are doing. We don't understand they're taking care of themselves or taking care of their family. They're just doing it in a context we're not familiar with. And this was written by a person who, what he used to do is, and I can't remember his name right now, but a degree of separation from him. But he used to work with the Marines. He was a Marine. And what he would do is, as they put up a new Marine base in a different location, he would help the Marines and the locals be able to kind of work together and function together. And quite often there were cultural differences, there were communication differences, but what they started to realize was that a lot of the difference were not value differences. And once they started to understand that, they were able to connect with each other.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. It makes sense. So you do training in companies, you do speaking as well?
Yeah, so I'm the two things. I'm a keynote speaker, probably 8 things. Sorry about that. But I'm a keynote speaker. So I speak at a lot of conferences and conventions. And then I'm a trainer, and I have a training company. I have other trainers with me. And we come in, we do deeper dives, especially with change management, dealing with disruption, unconscious bias, leadership, all those team building type things. And then we have a consulting side of the company. So if someone says, hey, I really want to do unconscious bias, I say, okay, great. How does this fit into your overall strategy? Well, we don't really have a strategy. So we help people to build a strategy that's really their own, that they believe in, that they can actually execute. And then, there's other things beyond that, but that's really the focus are those 3 things: speaking, training, and consulting.
The best way to get a hold of you, people, through your website, TonyChapman.com?
Yeah, everything's on my website. It's mind-blowing. If you go to my website, there's connections to all my social media. I literally have my cell phone number on my website.
Okay.
So you go through the web form, but if you spell my name properly, TonyChapman.com, CHATMAN.com, it's impossible not to find me.
Yeah. Well, I'll get that in the show notes.
Great.
For people who are driving, and I really appreciate your time today. This has been a fun conversation.
Thanks, Frank. Thanks for having me. It's been a real blast. Appreciate it.
Thanks for joining us on the Networking RX podcast. Please put what you've learned into action today, and let us know if you have questions, comments, or ideas for future topics. You can email them to us at podcast@amspirit.com. That's AMSPIRIT.com. Finally, so you never miss an episode, be sure to subscribe to the Networking RX podcast through iTunes, Overcast, or however you receive your podcasts. Now get out and network with someone.
The Networking RX podcast is the copyright production of AmSpirit Business Connection. All rights reserved.